Hello, everybody. Welcome to Plenary Session 9 of the Science of Consciousness online conference as it rolls along, day 4. And this afternoon, we have depending on where you are, this afternoon we have a very interesting session on Is the Universe Conscious? And our speakers are Miri Albahari from University of Western Australia, Philip Goff from University of Durham, Paavo Pylkkänen from Helsinki University, and Deepak Chopra from Chopra Global and many other areas of the universe. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker. She is the author of Analytical Buddhism and Other Works, Miri Albahari from the University of Western Australia in Perth. Welcome, Miri.
So just hi, can everyone hear me? I hope. So the South Indian sage Sri Ramana Maharshi, at age 16, he had a remarkable awakening. He became gripped with the thought that he was about to die. This initiated in him a spontaneous process of self-inquiry. He investigated what dies and what lives. In Ramana's own words, inquiring within, who is the seer, I saw the seer disappear, leaving that alone which exists forever. His was not a mere intellectual investigation, but deeply existential and transformative, remaining with him for the rest of his life. What he'd taken to be his own private consciousness, limited to his perspective, was now experienced as unbounded and unperishing, as beyond space and time, and as a substratum underlying what we take to be the world, but yet more real than the world of objects. Ramana's experience is not isolated. Mystics in many different traditions across different centuries have also had what has appeared to be the same profound insight. Aldous Huxley and others term this insight the perennial philosophy. My general project is to see how far I can develop the perennial philosophy and Ramana's experience from the perspective of Western analytical philosophy. I call this philosophical extrapolation perennial idealism. Idealism because reality is grounded in consciousness rather than, say, a material space-time. In this presentation, I'll briefly recap some of the dialectic of the modern mind-body debate with a view to showing not only how perennial idealism fits into the dialectic, but how it can be the next natural step, improving on its predecessors. I'll also talk about how the position hangs together internally. How can it be that our real abiding nature is that of pure consciousness, a consciousness which also grounds what we take to be the world? How could it work? So first, I'll introduce a bit of terminology. I take a subject to be a localized first-person perspective, having a conscious field in which objects, internal or external, appear. So there's something it's like to be a subject, a conscious subject, in what appears to be a world with objects and trees and sand and beach, and also a world of internal thoughts, emotions, desires, and so forth. The conscious field, which I've referred elsewhere to as witness consciousness, is a unified domain of awareness in which objects come and go. So imagine you're meditating on the breath and you're aware of the feeling of breathing, and then a sound comes in, and then you say sound and you bring your attention back to the breath. The field of consciousness is that in which is aware simultaneously of the sound and the breathing. Is not necessarily attentive. It's sometimes thought of as reflexive, self-effulgent, a luminous sense of presence. It has a sense of its own being built into it. It's also sometimes described as intransitive, not itself an object, but that which knows objects. And this conscious field is what is going to turn out to be the substratum, even though it doesn't seem like that to us. So perennial idealism challenges many of the things we pre-reflectively assume about conscious subjects in relation to the world, such as the idea that our conscious field offers an accurate window onto a mind-independent world and its objects, that there is a mind-independent world, that our conscious field goes where our body goes in space and time, and that a separate field of consciousness belongs to each subject, including cats and other animals, although what it's like to be them will be different. So perennial idealism denies all these common assumptions. Modern philosophy tends to accept most of these assumptions, apart from that which supposes our conscious field to give an accurate window onto the mind-independent world. The scientific picture of the external material world is characterized as mind-independent structures that don't much resemble how we experience them. So they, like going back to Democritus in ancient Greece, atoms and the void, or Galileo, everything characterized mathematically, they don't include any of the conscious qualities we are familiar with. In philosophy, that's generally the stance that is taken. So this raises a puzzle. How do consciousness and the material world relate? This is the mind-body problem. What it's like to be us, a conscious subject, with feelings of nostalgia, taste of chocolate, it seems very different from the physical mind-independent world. And various theories have been proposed to try to explain this relation. Dualism is the position that minds or mental properties are non-material and that our bodies are material. So Descartes in the 1600s very famously posited the mind as a thinking thing, a soul, which mediates with the body and brain via the pineal gland in the brain. Messages come from the body through the pineal gland, inform the soul, and then that informs and influences what it's like in our experience, and our experience then sends signals back to animate the body. Now, there are problems with dualism, including in modern day dualism. How can it be that something non-located, something non-spatial, can interface with something spatial? And how can it have any causal efficacy in the world, in the material world? So it seems that our bodies, the movement of our bodies can be entirely explained by brain events, that there's no room for a special conscious events to make a difference, not unless they are actually identified with brain events. So this is one of the things that motivates philosophers to be a materialist. Standard materialism is the position that everything, including minds, is made from non-conscious matter. So if we feel that we decide to lift our arm, that feeling is really nothing but a state of the brain. So it can explain the animation of our body. But what it doesn't explain so well is why it feels like that, why nostalgia feels like that. It seems we can understand everything about the brain, but yet there's still a further question. Why is it like that? Or why is it like anything at all? That is what David Chalmers termed the hard problem of consciousness. Materialism and dualism both agree on the assumption that the intrinsic nature of matter in and of itself is without consciousness. And I'm talking about standard materialism here. It's like, so as they sometimes say, all dark inside. But what is the nature of material? It's often been pointed out that physics characterizes matter as mathematical equations, abstractions. But what is being related and abstracted from? What's implementing the equations? It seems to leave matter bereft of a concrete categorical nature to implement the equations. Is it just a nest of abstractions? A lot of people don't think so. Galen Strawson calls this the hard problem of matter. Consciousness we are familiar with, we know what it's like, but matter, it seems very mysterious. So what could be its categorical nature if we agree that it must have it? Well, we have at hand a natural candidate, as it's often been pointed out. We know the categorical nature of one portion of the physical universe, our own embodied brains, what it's like from the inside. So why not let consciousness be that which implements all the equations to do with our bodies and brains? And more generally, why not let consciousness be that which implements the equations in the rest of the physical universe? After all, it's parsimonious. And Philip Goff had this very nice expression, why not color everything in with the same pen? So this has led to panpsychist materialism, and that's a sort of term which I'm using here. And that sews conscious subjects into the fundamental material constituents, giving a concrete categorical nature for the abstractions to adhere to. The objects that scientists study are the outer material shells that are characterized as abstract mind-independent structures. Their inner nature involves conscious subjects, what it's like to be a material entity from the inside. Micropsychism is the brand of this position by which the conscious fundaments occur at the micro level, such as with quantum mechanics. Cosmopsychism is the position that the conscious fundament is the cosmos. It depends on your preferred theory of what physical constituents are conscious. And panpsychism is a general position that all concrete differential manifestation is a conscious subject, an aggregate of subjects, or is part of a subject. So generally they don't think that things like coffee pots and coat hangers are conscious, but maybe molecules are, or atoms, or maybe molecules and atoms are a part of the conscious universe. Humans and animals get their consciousness from the consciousness ultimately of the ultimates, and maybe from some intermediaries. Now this position is seen to be advantageous. Unlike standard materialism, consciousness doesn't have to emerge at some arbitrarily high level, such as in the brain. It is there right from the get-go, built into the nature of matter. And unlike with dualism, it has a proper causal place in the universe. Rather than being extraneous or an epiphenomenon, it implements, it makes possible those abstract equations. So it seems to have a lot going for it. Here is a human perspective on a beach scene. We see various objects with other illustrative subjects included. Now, I'm not thinking that the coffee pot and the coat hanger are conscious, but I'm supposing, for the sake of illustration, that, say, aluminium molecules and plastic molecules and sand molecules are conscious, as well as crabs, cats, and trees. And that blue there is whatever you think the fundament is. But this is a very anthropocentric way of looking at it. Really, it's more like this. Consciousness is inside the material, implementing the physical equation. So the conscious subjects are implementing the physical equations. So does this really solve what's sometimes called the mind-body explanatory gap? There are various problems with panpsychism, and I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm skeptical, in fact, that it does a good job as a gap as it's touted to. So with standard materialism, recall the explanatory gap. Yet consciousness seems so utterly different to what it's like to be a conscious subject from abstract states of the brain. How could one thing come out of the other, basically? But we might ask, how is consciousness implementing abstract, mind-independent structures, as panpsychist materialism would hold, any less gappy than abstract, mind-independent structures implementing consciousness? So what it's like for me to look at a beach is somehow implementing these abstract structures of my brain. What it's like to be a molecule or a fundamental particle is implementing its external structure that's studied by physicists. I don't think that it's that much more obviously unmysterious. Here is how a panpsychist might reply, or the panpsychist materialist. Concrete stuff implementing abstract structures is easier to imagine than abstract structures implementing concrete stuff. It gets a right order of dependency. We can, for instance, more readily imagine sensory qualities, e.g. a kaleidoscope of colors implementing an abstract structure than abstract structures implementing sensory qualities. But I would reply to that, true, but it's precisely this kind of thinking in terms of sensory qualities existing outside of a perspective, like colors, it's this that lures us into supposing panpsychist materialism makes sense. So we think of colors in the public sphere, patterns of them implementing the abstract patterns, or rather like an ocean would implement a wave. But with panpsychist materialism, it's not qualities outside a perspective, e.g. colors implementing the structure, but qualities inside a subject's perspective, e.g. an experiencing of colors that are said to implement a mind-independent abstract structure. That's where the gap lies. And Philip Goff's student, Damien Alexiev, has come up with precisely this kind of problem. He calls it the privacy problem for panpsychism. So I think it's better to ban mind-independent abstract structures and their problematic interface with consciousness. I think so long as you're trying to bridge that gap, it will never be bridged. While it seemed that materialist or panpsychist materialism had gotten rid of the gap, all that really happened is that the gap migrated to a new hiding place in the very definition of matter. I think it's better to treat everything as being in the same domain, the domain of consciousness. So let's recall, with panpsychist idealism, it's not the qualities inside a perspective that are implementing the structure, but qualities inside a subject's perspective that are supposed to be implementing a mind-independent abstract structure, which is where the gap lies. But what happens if we recast panpsychism so that experiential qualities that appear from within a subject's first-person perspective implement structures that are inside, not outside the subject's perspective? So say a neuroscientist is looking at brain structures, the structures of the brain actually are inside the neuroscientist's perspective. Physical structures will now depend on how things appear to conscious subjects. This moves everything into the domain of consciousness, removing the gap between consciousness and mind-independent phenomena. Instead of trying to construe physical structures as qualifying the mind-independent exterior of a material object, e.g. the brain, whose interior is a conscious experience, why not construe physical structures as being derived from and dependent upon the inside of a subject's conscious experience? And I say physical, I'm not meaning material structures anymore. Instead of conscious subjects being trapped inside a structured mind-independent material universe, images of a structured mind-independent material universe are trapped inside conscious subjects. These are themselves grounded in pure consciousness. There is no mind-independent material universe. It's a very different metaphysical system. So we move away from panpsychist materialism with its mind-independent shell and towards panpsychist idealism, which will be perennial idealism. So what we have already done is gone through the debate, and we've seen how panpsychist materialism improves on dualism and materialism by taking consciousness more seriously. It doesn't take consciousness seriously enough because it still has an interface between consciousness and mind-independent matter. So I think the natural progression of the dialectic is to treat everything in consciousness. And so we've seen how this position could do that. But there are still, we need to ascertain, what exactly are subjects? How are these subjects grounded in consciousness? Can subjects be related in a way that makes sense of physical structures? And how would it be panpsychist? So subjects are imagery to a perspective. So before I said subjects are objects to a perspective in a conscious field, imagery is objects rendered as experiences. It's cognitive and sensory. I've coined the term cognoscensory. It's experiential. And imagery must automatically appear to a first-person perspective in a conscious field. So for example, if there's a pain, there's a pain in the room, and I say, whose pain? And they go, no one's pain, there's just a pain in the room. That doesn't make sense on this view. All experiences have to occur to a perspective in a conscious field. So the conscious field, just to recap, it's the domain of knowing awareness in which imagery comes and goes. It's reflexive, self-effulgent, and intransitive, not itself an object, but that which can know objects. It carries a sense of its own presence. The conscious field of awareness turns out on perennial idealism to be the substratum. Is that from which a subject's cognoscensory imagery comes and goes. Now we can observe this to some extent in our own experience. We observe imagery coming and going from within our conscious field. But this substratum is itself aperspectival, beyond space, time, subject, and imagery. And that part is harder to observe and to think of. How could this be? Is there a way to make better sense and to make more concrete this idea? So let's think about what immediately cues us into being in a spatio-temporal world with a sense of self. It all comes from the cognoscensory imagery. Regardless of how we think what the deeper picture is, immediately what cues us into being in space is, or the sense of being in space is all the visual, the audio. I can just start to hear the birds singing now, the tactile, proprioceptive, cognitive imagery. If it weren't for this imagery, we would have no sense of being in a spatial world. And that includes when dreaming. And imagery also cues us in to the sense of passing time. If there were no sight, sound, smells, thoughts, or anything, we wouldn't have a sense that time passes. And it also, imagery cues us in to the sense of being a self that's in the body. Without any memories, and imagery wouldn't have a sense of self. So this gives us a clue as to how we can go about thinking about the conscious field. If you remove all the cognoscensory imagery, leaving only the conscious field, a sense of presence, there'll be nothing left to cue the conscious field into any sense of occupying space, time, or a personal perspective. So I invite you to imaginatively immerse yourself in what I've called a cognoscensory deprivation tank. So you are a subject, imagery to a perspective, arising from conscious awareness. And one by one, all of your imagery goes. You're left with cognitive imagery, that also goes. But then there's nothing to cue the perspective into any spatial temporal world. All that will remain is a conscious field whose reflexive presence will be by default seem unbounded by space, the passing of time, or anything to suggest a localized perspective. So how do subjects, images to a perspective, which are grounded in consciousness, relate to one another in a way that explains the appearance of the world? What manifests to us as imagery to our perspective is the direct registration of ourselves as subjects as we go about indirectly registering other subjects. Put another way, a conscious subject carries a perspective furnished by object imagery that gives the impression of an external world. What we take to be objects in this world are the outward appearances of other subjects, many in part or in whole, arising from consciousness. This rendering of all manifestation or as conscious subjects makes perennial idealism a form of panpsychism. I should say differential manifestation. So what are the other subjects? Well, I would count, when I look at an object that's a person, I would also think they are a subject. A cat is a subject. I don't think a coffee pot and a coat hanger is a subject, but perhaps molecules are subjects, perhaps atoms are subjects, perhaps the cosmos is a subject of which these are the outward appearances. I leave that open for the panpsychist to decide. That's something being debated. The important thing is everything that I'm aware of will be the presentation or appearance of another subject that frames my perspective. So the imagery that appears to a subject's perspective depends on how complex the subjects are and what other subjects impinge on them. It's incredibly vast and interconnected. The structures we attribute to objects are derived from the imagistic appearance of other subjects that frame our perspective. So take an aluminium molecule and the coffee pot. Physical structures of these are grounded inside a subject's conscious experience. So this is obviously, I'm only limited to using visual imagery here, but that's what my depiction of what it's like to be an aluminium molecule. They collectively appear to us as a coffee pot, to the naked eye, under a microscope as a molecule, and we abstract from our experience what we know about it chemically, microphysically. But what ensures that the qualities will continue to appear in a law-like, predictable way? Not independent laws of nature relating subjects to one another, but dispositions that characterize the subject itself. Subjects on this view are dispositional, permitting predictability. Just as we say that a lemon is disposed to look yellow and taste sour to humans, a given subject is disposed to appear to itself in a particular way, e.g. as human, tree, animal, molecule, cosmos, in response to the impingement of other subjects. And other subjects are disposed to appear to a given subject in a particular way, as well as not appear to it in a particular way. So here are our possible subjects superimposed upon a human-centered view. This would be the human perspective on the beach, or these are all these different, huge amount of subjects. Collectively, they appear to a person in that way. That's a perspective. This is maybe the cat's perspective with the human in it. Everything is disposed to appear to a cat that way. The aluminium molecule's perspective. Sand molecules' perspective on other molecules. Sand molecules' perspective on other molecules. In fact, when we say other molecules, we're really meaning a human's perspective on the sand and its molecules. There's no such thing as that molecular structure independently of how it appears to a human perspective. There's no beach or world in and of itself. There are just co-manifesting subjects arising from a ground of boundless aperspectival consciousness. Thanks.
Thank you. Do any of the other speakers have a question for Miri? Miri, there's a question from someone.
Okay.
Do you believe there? Do you believe that there is other life, other beings in this expanded world of consciousness?
Do I believe there are other beings? Yes, so, plenty of other beings. Yourself, Stuart, perhaps sand molecules, perhaps the cosmos is another being. Everything that we think of as subjects as other beings. Maybe there's alien life forms, I don't know.
One more, from Miri, a field is something defined over a spatial domain. In idealism, space is a construct within consciousness. It is not prior to consciousness. So surely it is circular to say the conscious mind is a field defined over what spatial measure?
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. Field, unfortunately, we are limited to using metaphors. And I had meant to say that in the longer version of my talk, but I use the word field, but that's only metaphorical, just as when I use a term light for consciousness, that's metaphorical. It's not literally a spatial field, but that's the best we can do in trying to convey that it's, again, I use the space in which objects appear was space of experience, but it's, yeah, it's just a metaphor, it's not literal.
Okay, we should move on. Thank you very much.
Yep,
We're going to have
you.
more questions. We'll have time at the end. Philip Goff from Durham University. Philip, I've misplaced the title of your talk, so please remind us, me and everybody. There you go. Thank you. Philip Goff, Durham University.
Myself, forgot to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We hear you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Great to be here. I'll get straight on with it. So, the question I want to start with is, what do we need to do in order to solve the hard problem of consciousness? What does a theory need to do before we can say, that's it, job done, we can all go home now? I want to suggest that a theory of consciousness needs to satisfy two constraints that I'm going to call an external constraint and an internal constraint. So the external constraint is simply to fit the empirical data. The internal constraint is that the theory needs to close explanatory gaps. So an explanatory gap is where we have emergence without explanation, right? So we have Y emerging from X, and we've just got no explanation as to how X is sufficient to be able to produce Y. So the most discussed example in this context of this is the explanatory gap, the well-known, much discussed explanatory gap at the core of materialism. That there's this huge challenge of getting from bridging the gap from the purely quantitative properties of physical science to the qualitative properties of conscious experience. And in my view, no one's made even the sort of slightest progress in trying to bridge that gap. So I think it's quite easy to satisfy one of these constraints. The difficult thing is satisfying both of them. I think the dualist has no problem satisfying the internal constraint. So your classic David Chalmers dualist just postulates basic laws of nature that bridge the gap from the physical facts of the brain to the properties of consciousness. I think that's a perfectly satisfactory way of bridging the explanatory gap. You know, science employs fundamental laws all the time. However, dualism has problems with the external constraint, because on the David Chalmers type view, you've got these non-physical properties popping up in the brain all the time, and contemporary neuroscience seems to show no sign of these non-physical properties all over the place in the brain. So it's hard for the dualist to square their view with the empirical facts. Materialism, conversely, I think, has no problems with the external constraint, with fitting the empirical data, but as we've already discussed, it has this huge difficulty with the internal constraint, bridging the well-known explanatory gap. So this is how I conceive of what we need out of, it's important to get precise on, what we need out of the theory of consciousness. I think what we need is something that satisfies both of these constraints. So in recent years, there has emerged a great hope in the form of panpsychism. A number of philosophers, including myself, have developed various forms of a Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychism that's become known as Russellian Panpsychism. And this talk nicely follows from Miri's talk, because I guess this is what she was calling panpsychist materialism. So she's already described this. I'll just very briefly give the basic idea of the view. So the starting point is that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. And that can seem like a really strange claim at first. You know, you read a physics textbook, you seem to learn all these incredible things about the nature of space and time and matter. But actually, it turns out upon reflection that for all its virtues, physics is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, what it does. You know, so think about what physics tells us about an electron. It tells us it has mass and charge. And these properties are completely characterized in terms of behavior, things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. This is all about behavior, what the particle does. Physics leaves us completely in the dark about what philosophers like to call the intrinsic nature of matter, what matter is in and of itself, independently of its behavior. So I sometimes like to give a chess piece analogy for this. So suppose you're looking at some chess pieces there on the board. If you want to play the game, then you're going to want to know how the pieces move on the board, what they can do, which pieces can take other pieces. But suppose you're someone who makes chess pieces, then you're probably going to be interested in the chess pieces themselves, independently of their moves on the board. Are they made of wood? Are they made of plastic? Are they made of metal? So this is the focus on the intrinsic nature of the chess piece. So by analogy, you may very well, turning back to physics, you may very well be interested in what physics has to tell us about what particles can do, how they interact, how they behave. But you may also be interested in what, say, an electron is in and of itself, independently of its behavior, its intrinsic nature. And on this score, physics has nothing to say. So it turns out there's this huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. The proposal of the Russellian panpsychist is to put consciousness in that hole, right? We're looking for a place for consciousness. We've got a hole. Let's try and put consciousness in the hole. So the important thing to say is that this is not dualism, right? There's just matter, maybe particles or fields, but matter can be described from two perspectives. Physics describes it, as it were, from the outside in terms of its behavior, what it does, but matter from the inside in its intrinsic nature is constituted of forms of consciousness. Okay, so this is the core of the Russellian panpsychist view. And the great hope of a number of philosophers the last 5 or 10 years is that this view has a promise to avoid both the difficulties faced by materialism on the one hand and the difficulties faced by dualism on the other. So the hope is it can avoid the explanatory gap worries of physicalism, because we're not trying to get from the physical facts to the facts about consciousness. We avoid at least that classic explanatory gap. But it also avoids the empirical worries of dualism, allegedly, because on this view, consciousness is incorporated into the physical world. So we just avoid the need for these empirically dubious non-physical properties. And this is related to what Miri was talking about earlier. So that's the great hope. Problem solved. We can all go home. Unfortunately, some problems have more recently emerged. So although the panpsychist is taking consciousness in general as basic, they're not taking human consciousness as basic. Human consciousness is somehow emergent from more fundamental forms of consciousness. Typically, on panpsychist views, the basic kinds of consciousness will be very simple forms of consciousness of basic particles like electrons and quarks. And then human consciousness is somehow built up from those very simple forms of consciousness. So then the panpsychist has this deep challenge where how do we bridge the gap from the non-emergent forms of consciousness, perhaps consciousness of particles, to the emergent forms of consciousness, i.e. the consciousness of humans and other animals. And there's, broadly speaking, two approaches here: strong emergentism and weak emergentism. The strong emergentist just postulates extra laws of nature to bridge the gap. So it might just be a basic law of nature that when you've got conscious particles arranged in a certain way, you get consciousness associated with the system as a whole. The weak emergentist tries to bridge the gap without recourse to fundamental laws. So they just say, look, all you need to do is arrange conscious particles in a certain way, and bingo, you've got a conscious brain. Just like, you know, you mold clay in a certain way, bingo, you've got a statue. You don't need extra laws of nature to bridge the gap from facts about the clay to facts about the statue. Similarly, for the weak emergentist, you don't need special extra laws of nature to bridge the gap from particle consciousness to human consciousness. But the worry here, as many people have pointed out in the recent literature, is that people have argued that the strong emergentist faces all the problems of dualism, and the weak emergentist faces all the problems of physicalism. So just briefly, the thought is, you know, the strong emergentist has this new irreducible forms of system level consciousness emerging in the brain all the time. And neuroscience doesn't seem to show any sign of kind of irreducible systems level properties. It seems like everything we find in the brain can be reduced to sort of more basic levels of chemistry or physics. So you might think this is essentially the same problem the dualist faces. We don't seem to find these radically new properties in the brain. The weak emergentist, on the other hand, so why do they face explanatory gap worries? But they avoid the classic explanatory gap of getting from the physical to consciousness. But there looks to be a kind of similar explanatory gap getting from facts about particle consciousness to facts about systems level consciousness. And one way of pushing this is with a slight twist on the zombie thought experiment. So classical zombies are physical duplicates of human beings that have absolutely no consciousness at all. But we can also think about panpsychist zombies. So a panpsychist zombie is a physical duplicate of a human being, such that all its little bits are conscious, all the particles making up are conscious, but there's no consciousness corresponding to the brain or the organism or any macro level bit. They seem panpsychist zombies seem, you know, pretty much as conceivable as regular zombies. And we won't get into the details here, but it looks pretty straightforward that if David Chalmers is right that regular zombies cause problems for materialism, it looks like panpsychist zombies are also going to cause problems for weak emergentist panpsychism. Okay, so people have argued, look, we've got two versions of panpsychism. The strong emergentist one faces all the problems of dualism. The weak emergentist one, all the problems of physicalism. We've got nowhere. So I've argued actually these problems aren't as bad as they initially might seem. But what I want to do here is and what I've been working on recently is a new form of panpsychism that just avoids these worries altogether. And that's what I want to describe to you in the remaining time. I'll start by just giving you the brief idea in a couple of slides, and then I'll go into more detail. So the basic idea is it's a kind of hybrid view where we have strong emergentism about subjects, but weak emergentism about their conscious states. So we have emergent subjects arising in accordance with just basic laws of nature, but these emergent subjects, when they come into existence, they don't come with their own brand new forms of consciousness. Rather, they, as it were, inherit streams of consciousness from the level of basic physics. So one key concept here is what I'm going to call qualia transference, which is just the basic idea that the conscious states of one subject can be transferred to another subject, or it's coherent to suppose this possibility. So here's a very silly toy example to make the idea clear. So imagine a wicked witch who gets really bad migraines all the time, but it doesn't bother her because every time she gets a migraine, she just magically transfers the migraine to an unfortunate passerby. So the conscious state, the painful conscious state, just goes from her stream of consciousness into somebody else's stream of consciousness. So analogously on this view, these emergent subjects don't come with their own forms of consciousness. They inherit consciousness. Conscious states are transferred from the level of fundamental physics to these emergent subjects. And then the hope is, how do I move my slides on? Sorry. So the hope is that this avoids the problems. the hope is we can close the explanatory gap because we've got basic laws of nature that determine A, that there are emergent subjects, and B, which streams of consciousness they inherit from non-emergent subjects. So we kind of close the explanatory gap in the same way that the dualist does. But the hope is that this better fits the empirical data because this theory can easily accommodate the empirical fact that systems involving emergent subjects obey the same laws as systems which don't. So I think this is really the core of the empirical problem facing dualism and strong emergentist panpsychism, is that systems with emergent consciousness, you'd expect if these kind of non-physical properties or irreducible systems level properties popped up in the brain, then the brain would start behaving very differently to other physical systems. It would really start obeying different laws to other physical systems. And that's not what we seem to find. However, in contrast, on the view I'm articulating here, these emergent subjects, they inherit properties from the level of fundamental physics. And so we'd expect them to just obey the bog standard laws of fundamental physics, like every other physical system. So that's why it avoids the empirical problems of dualism and related theories. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now I'm going to go into it in more detail. So this is a form of cosmopsychism fitting with the subject of this panel. Forms of cosmopsychism inspired by the priority monism of Jonathan Schaffer, according to which the one fundamental object is the universe and all facts are grounded in facts about the universe. So rather than thinking that everything exists and is the way it is because of arrangements of particles, on this view, everything exists and is the way it is because of facts about the universe as a whole. And you know, one attractive thing about priority monism is it fits quite nicely with a field ontology, and a field ontology in turn fits quite nicely with contemporary physics. So we think the fundamental components are universe-wide fields, and the bearer of those fundamental universe-wide fields is the universe as a whole. Now, this view doesn't imply anything like panpsychism, but if you combine it with panpsychism, you get cosmopsychism, the view that the universe is a conscious subject and the one non-emergent entity, and all other facts depend on facts about the universe subject. And on the view that I'm articulating here, the structure uncovered by physics is the structure of the experience of the universe subject. So you imagine giving a really complicated description of everything in the language of fundamental physics, every single quark and electron, you get an incredibly complicated structure. That structure is the structure of the universe subject. Very messy. Okay, so how do we get, in terms of this view, how do we account for human and animal subjects? That's what we're ultimately interested in. So I've actually drawn inspiration here from someone at the polar opposite end of the consciousness debate from me, namely Daniel Dennett, specifically his work on real patterns. I'll cut out a bit here because I'm pressed for time. But basically, I think it's a plausible assumption that the structure of animal experience is present in the physical structure of the brain if you abstract away from a lot of detail. You know, I think it's plausible that human consciousness corresponds to high-level information structures in the brain. If you take the global workspace theory, for example, consciousness corresponds to information that's broadly available for many systems in the brain. So if you take the very, very complex structure in my brain, you abstract away from a lot of detail in the right kind of way, you should be able to find those high-level information structures. Now, if that's right, and if you combine it with the view I've been articulating, it follows that, this is the next thing on the slide, the experience of the universe subject contains structures isomorphic with the structure of animal experience. So if you take the very, very complex experience of the universe, you isolate the bit that's in my head, you abstract away from a lot of detail, then you're going to get structures isomorphic with the structures of my conscious experience. Okay, so the challenge is, what we need to do is we need to formulate laws of nature that determine that there are subjects that inherit those aspects of cosmic experience that are structurally isomorphic with animal experience. So let's get a bit more specific about this. I've summed up two principles that capture the kind of laws we need. the localization principle and the thinning principle. The localization principle tells us that we need laws ensuring that there are emergent subjects corresponding to the regions of space where brains are located. So I think that's very straightforward, just ensures that there are subjects of experience where we need them to be. The thinning principle is more complicated. This says that we need laws ensuring that each non-fundamental subject inherits a thinned out version of the experience contained in the region it occupies. Okay, so there's a notion of thinning out here, which is important for the theory, which needs clarification. So the simplest kind of qualia transference would be where all of the experiences of one subject are transferred to another. So if I like magically took all of my conscious experience right now and just put it in Stuart's head, then what it's like to be Stuart would be what it was like to be me a split second earlier. Right? But it seems to me, so that would be the simplest case, but it seems to me it could also be that Stuart inherits some aspects of my conscious experience. So suppose I'm having a visual experience of a countryside scene with a lake and birds and trees, and then Stuart magically inherits some aspects of my experience. So he ends up with kind of the same scene, but with a lot of detail missed out. Maybe there's just a lake, no trees, no birds. So that seems a coherent possibility. Okay, so applying this to the view I'm trying to articulate. So the idea would be that in my head, there is incredibly complex experience corresponding to every quark and electron. That's not my experience, right? That's experience born by the universe. What I inherit are some aspects of that very busy experience. And so I end up with a thinned out version of that very complex experience born by the universe. And the hope is if you did the thinning out in the right way, you'd get those kind of, you'd get experience with the structure that human experience in fact has, corresponding to sort of higher level information structures in the brain. Okay, so let's get even more concrete by seeing how this would work out with a specific theory, with a one candidate for the correct neuroscientific theory of consciousness, namely integrated information theory, or IIT. Okay, so I'm not advocating IIT, I'm just saying for the sake of discussion, let's suppose this turns out to be the true neuroscientific theory and look at what the theory would be like in that scenario. So integrated information theory revolves around the notion of integrated information, represented by the Greek letter phi, which Tononi gives a mathematically precise definition of, I'm not going to go into, but very, very roughly, massively oversimplifying, the idea is you get consciousness in a system when there's more phi in the system than there is in any of its parts. So suppose that turns out to be the true neuroscientific theory of consciousness, then if you plug in this view I'm articulating, we'd end up with the following localization law and thinning law. The localization law would be that there is an emergent subject corresponding to location L. That's IFF is if and only if, a bit jargony there, sorry. If and only if there is more phi in L considered as a whole than in any part of L. And then the thinning law would be emergent subjects inherit those aspects of experience within L that support high levels of phi. So we get the result we want, because if IIT, integrated information theory, turns out to be the true neuroscientific theory, then these laws would predict that we have subjects of experience where we pre-theoretically think that they are, and they have the kind of consciousness which contemporary neuroscience tells us they have, with the structure that contemporary neuroscience tells us that they have. We'd have, in other words, a complete theory of consciousness. Okay, so just to bring things to a close. Oh, actually, I'm doing not too bad for time. Oh, here's a picture of my book, which is coming out in the US paperback, coming out 6th of October, if I can just give a quick plug to that. It's very, very accessible introduction to the problem of consciousness, traces it back to the intellectual foundations of the scientific revolution and Galileo's, the way Galileo set up the philosophical foundations of the scientific revolution, rejects the sort of dualist and materialist solutions, and explores and defends the panpsychist alternative. Okay, but so the view I'm pressing on you today is what I'm going to call hybrid cosmopsychism. And I can sum up the view in the following 3 principles. It is that the universe is a conscious subject and all facts depend on facts about that conscious subject. Emergent subjects causally arise from the universe in accordance with basic laws, but emergent subjects inherit streams of consciousness from the universe subject. So they don't come with their own brand new forms of consciousness. They inherit forms of consciousness from the universe subject and give those streams of consciousness back to the universe subject when they cease to exist. And the advantages of this view, I suggest, is that in contrast to physicalism, it avoids explanatory gaps. In contrast to dualism, it's completely consistent with empirical findings. And so, problem solved. Job done, we can all go home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. We have time for a couple questions. There are a couple in the chat line. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, to Philip, what remains as the intrinsic nature of an object after the sum total of all possible ways it can behave, i.e. interact with other objects, have been accounted for?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So, I mean, it is, there are many philosophers that challenge the need for intrinsic natures, such as my colleague Stephen Mumford might say, well, you know, if science just tells us what an electron does, maybe that's all there is to its nature. I mean, there are 2 things that can be said in response to this. I mean, one, there are lines of argument going back to Bertrand Russell that try to show that if you do without intrinsic natures, you end up in a kind of vicious circularity because everything ends up being defined in terms of everything else. I don't have time to go into those arguments, but that's one line of argument. But even if that fails, even if there are intelligible stories of reality that don't have intrinsic natures, I still think we have reason to postulate intrinsic natures. Why? Because we get these cool Russellian panpsychist theories of consciousness that do what we need a theory of consciousness to do. So I think there's that theoretical need to postulate intrinsic natures in order to account for consciousness in a satisfying way, closing explanatory gaps and fitting the empirical data.
I have a question of my own, actually, for you and Miri. You're talking about going inside of molecules and atoms, and you mentioned, or maybe Miri mentioned, quantum mechanics, because then you see the subatomic particles. But at that level, you also get into the measurement problem, the fact that these atoms and their particles and even molecules may be in multiple superposition states of multiple possibilities, but yet when observed or when collapsed or however you think of it, they become classical objects. So these atoms and classical objects in general, at some level, are constantly oscillating between quantum classical, quantum classical, quantum classical. And at least in Roger Penrose's view, the collapse, the reduction from the quantum to the classical gives rise to consciousness. So it's not a property of the matter of the atom, it's a property of the process which gives rise to that state of matter. How does that jive with your approach?
Miri?
Philip, you go. Yeah.
Well, I'm actually a fan of the Bohmian view, but I don't think that matters here. I mean, I think, look, what I'm envisaging is a broad framework that would need to be combined with an empirical theory. I gave IIT as an example, but it could equally be yours and Roger's view, Stuart. You know, I'm giving a framework that could be joined with, I see the science of consciousness as having a theoretical and an empirical component. What I'm trying to do in the theoretical component is give a broad framework that could close explanatory gaps in an empirically adequate way. But then we need more experimentally minded scientists, philosophers to plug that in with the empirical details. You know, it could be your theory, it could be another theory. So I think it's compatible with any empirical working out of, the details there.
Our theory is testable. But anyway, there's one more question for you. Actually, 2 more, and then we'll move on. Actually, let's just take one of them because we're running late. Question for Philip. Could you give a well-defined specific example of an empirical problem with David Chalmers type dualism?
Well, the thought is that, I mean, one way you could have, the worry is you have these non-physical properties popping up in the brain, and neuroscience doesn't seem to show any signs of these properties. One way around this is to be an epiphenomenalist and say the non-physical properties just don't do anything. But then, you know, like many people, I find that, you know, that quite an intolerable option. This is why, incidentally, David Chalmers is now trying to think about, can consciousness collapse the wave function, to try and get around this problem, to give an empirical role for non-physical consciousness. That's very interesting, you know, and I mean, I want to keep all options on the table, but you know, there's clearly a deep problem there. It's to do with the causal exclusion problem related to Jagwan Kim, if you want to be more precise about this. Oh, I also want to mention this paper. You know, this is a very short talk. This paper is on my website if people want to look at the details where I go into that kind of thing and other things in more detail. But it's the causal exclusion problem would be the worry.
Well, Chalmers' view in quantum mechanics with Kelvin McQueen is kind of goes back to von Neumann and Wigner, and 100 years ago, that consciousness causes collapse, which is a dualist position that puts consciousness outside science, doesn't explain what it is or how it causes collapse. But the view we have, Roger has, is 180 degrees opposite, that collapse occurs spontaneously and causes consciousness. And it's the only scientific mechanism ever proposed, really. IIT is more of a correlation, or maybe I'm not understanding it. But in any case, we'll hear more about that tomorrow. I don't see Paavo, so let's go to the last question for Philip. Oh, there he is. Okay, we'll save that one. It's a long one. So without further ado, Paavo just sat down. Hi, Paavo. Philip, thank you very much. Great talk.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
And please stick around. I know it's late in UK, but we will want you for the discussion. So thank you, Philip. It's a great pleasure now to introduce an old friend, professor at the University of Helsinki and University of Skövde in Sweden, who is going to talk something about David Bohm, I'm pretty sure. Paavo Pylkkänen. Paavo, please come in. Good to see you.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, greetings also from Helsinki. It's about 1:15 in the morning. So let's see. Do my share screen,
please.
And then I get this. Does it work? And then let's see over here. Okay, so now it's working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Anyway, so here we go. I must confess that I haven't thought about so much this question of, is the universe conscious? So this is kind of my first writing about this, or actually talking here. But anyway, it's a little bit kind of a clumsy title for you. Does quantum panpsychism lead to cosmic idealism? But let's go with it. Let me see now. Gosh, it doesn't over here. Anyway, so just for those of you not familiar with my research, I've been working in this area of mind, matter, and quantum theory, and initially with David Bohm, and then later on with Basil Hiley, you know, who worked with Bohm for 30 years. Was still working with Hiley on these questions. But in my own work, I guess I would say I've been working on analogies between quantum process and thought. And then also the idea that of Bohm's idea of implicate order as a kind of a common structure with matter and conscious experience, or if you like, the common architecture. And also then, you know, Bohm also had this so-called hidden variable interpretation of quantum theory, or the Bohm theory, which then later on they understood it in a new way in terms of the notion of active information, which I'll talk a little bit here. And well, let's say, you see, what's this, the idea, you know, this, when Bohm proposed the hidden variable theory in 52, it was a pretty materialistic theory, you know. You had an electron being guided by this new kind of field. But later on, when they examined it, then it kind of became perhaps less materialistic, more radical. They were proposing that an electron is a particle accompanied by a new type of field containing active information, which literally informs the particle rather than pushes and pulls it mechanically. So that's an idea we've been exploring also with Hailey. And you see, well, what we said is that it's tempting to see such active information at the quantum level as providing the long-sought missing link between the mental and physical side of reality. Because, you know, quantum theory being a fundamental theory, and if we have something like information playing an objective and active role, it's not just information for us, but it's really, you know, something that exists out there and making things happen. So that it could be a kind of a link also enabling maybe even causal influences between mental and physical, what we call mental and physical side. But, you know, when we think about consciousness, so it could also perhaps, this active information could be the proto-phenomenal ground from which conscious experience in a full sense emerges. So that's like these basic ideas here. And so in this talk, well, I say a little bit about the hard problem of consciousness, and also something about this Bohm interpretation notion of active information, and then trying to connect to the theme of this session. So, you know, how does it connect to panpsychism and the question, is the universe conscious? So, of course, people have already mentioned the hard problem of consciousness, which is to explain how and why physical processes give rise to consciousness. Of course, it was before Chalmers, but Chalmers kind of invigorated it. And one interesting thing here is what Chalmers has actually quite recently emphasized is that you see, one has to take materialism seriously in order to take the hard problem seriously as a problem. Because if you're a dualist, so, you know, the hard problem will be unsurprising and not even perhaps worth addressing. Because you have this, you know, you're just saying, you're assuming that the mental and physical are fundamentally distinct, and that's that. And you could discuss things like, well, how do they interact? But the problem of explaining the mental and physical terms doesn't really arise, because you already assume that you don't have to do that. You know, they're two different things, two different universes, if you like. Substances, as we used to say in philosophy, yeah. Okay, so, and now what about the hard problem? So, I mean, this is not, again, there have been many attempts to solve it, but at least by 2010, they wasn't too impressed. He just said, well, you know, we've had all these neurobiological and cognitive models of consciousness, but really, usually not solutions to the hard problem. And then when they have, then people are not convinced. And at the same time, even the so-called non-reductive theories of consciousness are not doing that well either. I guess I guess things may have changed a little bit with all this panpsychism, but it would be actually interesting to just ask today what he would say about this. Anyway. And so now, okay, but let's go back. So let's say that the hard problem is to explain how and why physical processes give rise to consciousness. So if we do this rigorously in a scientific philosophical way, we also have to tackle these basic categories in terms of our best theories. And that implies that quantum theory is at least potentially relevant to the hard problem. And of course, if you look at a lot of physicalist philosophers of mind, more mainstream, many of them don't worry about quantum mechanics. So in a way, this is just to note that maybe we should, and you know, that's what we've been doing. But again, who knows? Maybe in the end, quantum theory will not be relevant, that you can explain the mind in some more classical way, who knows? But I guess people here, a lot of people, Stuart like and myself, we've been bitten by the quantum bug. And so that's why we explored these questions. And of course, with Basil Hailey, you know, Bohm died in '92, but you know, Basil and I kept working on these things. So we've been trying to understand the fundamental changes quantum theory and relativity bring to our view of the physical world. On the one hand, looking at what I already mentioned, this Bohm theory, and also this implicate order framework, which is kind of one framework in which to bring together quantum theory of general relativity. No, that's well known as the other, you know, like loop quantum gravity and all those things, but it's kind of try to do the same sort of thing already early on. Now, and then, well, are any of these things we've been doing relevant to the hard problem of consciousness? And we have actually suggested that they are. And again, consider what I already mentioned about this thing that, you know, when there's this Bohm theory, which postulates that the particle is not a particle or a field, which would be the case in the usual, you know, interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's actually always a particle and a field. And the idea there being the field guides the particle through a new potential, the quantum potential. And in this way, one can give an intelligible explanation of many puzzling quantum phenomena, such as the two-slit experiment, tunneling, the measurement problem, etc. And here, just show, this is a slide from Basil. I don't know how to make these things, but this will give you just a bit of, this just shows you how the Bohm theory explains the two-slit experiment. So, you know, the particles are coming through those slits. And if they were Newtonian particles, they go pretty in straight lines, but because there's also this quantum field and quantum potential, they will actually encounter the thing on the right. You can think of it as a little bit of a mountain, so nobody wants to go up there where it's very high. And so you can see how the quantum potential and the trajectories actually match. And the exciting thing there is this, of course, that if you look at the equation of the quantum potential, you can see that the R is the amplitude of the quantum wave. And you can see that the size of the R doesn't matter because it will cancel out. So a big field, big wave will have the same influence as a small wave. And actually the only thing that makes it matters is the form, because there's the second spatial derivative, the nabla there, which is in the, so it's the form of the wave that decides this quantum potential, if you like, decides this mounting that the electron has to obey. And so you see that, so therefore we could say that the philosophically interesting point in the Bohm theory is that this quantum potential only depends on the form of this field. And this gave then rise to the idea that the field is informing or putting form into the movement of the particle rather than pushing and pulling mechanically. And this is something that Bohm then called active information, which you can of course find in many other contexts. And think of a simple analogy of ship guided by radio waves. So, you know, the waves are not pushing and pulling the ship, but the radio waves have a small energy that informs the greater energy of the ship. You know, same thing with computers. But there is also active, but these are man-made devices. There is also active information in biological contexts. And think about a way that information content in the DNA molecule guides protein construction. Again, that's information for the cell. It's not information for us. So we have to get another way of thinking about information as something that exists out there independently of us, making things happen. And here's just a little bit, actually, I met recently Anita Goel. It was a meeting organized by Stuart in Tucson in January, when we could still fly around. And so what she has done is to study molecular machines that read and write information into molecules of DNA, writing that there are these nanomotors that transduce chemical free energy into mechanical work as they copy biological information stored in the DNA molecule. And you can look at these as information processing machines that use information in their environment to evolve or adapt the way they read out DNA. And she's kind of interesting, the idea that information from their environment could couple into and modulate the dynamics of these nanomachines as they replicate or transcribe genetic information. Perhaps even feeling maybe something like consciousness could come into it. But anyway, so she has also suggested that quantum mechanics may play a role in influencing the motors as they read and write bits of DNA. And actually we discussed this quite a bit in Tucson. She suggested it's worth exploring whether even the Bohm's notion of active information might be relevant here. But we haven't. I thought she would. Is she in this conference? I thought she might be, but maybe not. But anyway, to just give you an example of how this kind of, you know, this connects with some work in biology. But of course, active information is something that would easily work in human subjective experience. So let's say you're driving a car, you're reading a map, and of course the information contained in the map would then give rise to virtual activities, possible routes in the mind, and you will typically, one of these will realize as an actual movement into territory, depending on where you want to go. So this is a bit analogous to the way the active information works even at the quantum level, that you have this potentially active information everywhere where the field is spread, actually active where the particle actually is. Anyway. So, okay, so active information is something very general. We find it all over the place at different levels. And if we say that it even applies at the quantum level, well, it's maybe radically interesting, but again, we could ask, but it doesn't have anything to do with the hard problem of consciousness. Now, Bohm himself actually sketched a new theory of mind and matter based on this notion, and I discussed it quite a bit with him. I used to know him the late 80s, early 90s, and this is sort of thing. We're talking about, of course, quantum mechanics and Krishnamurti, but also quite a lot about this mind and matter. And you see, in the first formulation, when he published this as a paper, he actually, in that paper, he wrote that in some sense, talking about this active information with the electrons, he would say, in some sense, the rudimentary consciousness is present even at the level of particle physics. So the idea there being that the electron has this field of information through which is it, as it were, even like perceiving the environment, if you like. It's at least an analogy to what we're doing with our, electromagnetic field. Now, I don't know, in a later version, Bohm qualified this. Maybe his physics colleagues were saying that now you've gone, off the wall, that, maybe it's too, maybe panpsychism was still not out of the closet at the time, who knows? Anyway, so he did change it in the later version, and qualifying and saying that, the quantum theory, which is now basic, implies that the particles of physics have certain primitive mind-like qualities, which are not possible in terms of Newtonian concepts, though, of course, they do not have consciousness. So he was kind of putting that into there, that kind of rejecting that as an absurd notion that you would have experience with the little thingies. Okay, now, now to say that the rudimentary consciousness is present even at the level of particle physics is to endorse panpsychism. So, okay, maybe 86, Bohm was endorsing that. Whereas to say that particles of physics have certain primitive mind-like qualities, but that they do not have consciousness, is compatible with a weaker doctrine, which is known as pan-protopsychism. So therefore, the word that I had in the title. And here's a nice, Dave Chalmers, he's like, Dave is of course like a dictionary, so you want to see what something means, so you just go and check some of his papers. Anyway, so pan-protopsychism would be the view that these fundamental physical entities are proto-conscious. And so, so we could say that proto-phenomenal properties are special properties that are not phenomenal, meaning there is nothing it is like to have a single proto-phenomenal property. However, collectively they can constitute phenomenal properties, perhaps when arranged in the right structure. So pan-protopsychism is the view that some fundamental physical entities have proto-phenomenal properties. So, the electrons here, let's say they are fundamental entities, and and we're saying, Bohm was saying that there is this active information. So let's play with the idea and say that active information at the quantum level has a proto-phenomenal property. So there's nothing it is like to be a single electron. So it's not panpsychism in a full sense. However, when electrons and other elementary particles and fields are arranged in the right structure, for example, that of the human brain, phenomenal properties in a full sense emerge from the underlying proto-phenomenal ground. And I've actually recently discussed this there's this Routledge Handbook of Panpsychism, where actually Miri and Philip also have papers. And another good who discusses Bohm quite well is David Skrebina, who's actually visiting Helsinki at the moment. So we had some nice discussions already with Dave. Anyway. And now so I actually made this proposal in some of the papers, and I was inspired, of course, here by Chalmers' own attempt to solve the hard problem, namely this double aspect theory of information, where Chalmers was saying that information, or at least some information, has two basic aspects, a physical aspect and a phenomenal aspect. This has the status of a basic principle that might underlie and explain the emergence of experience from the physical. Experience arises by virtue of its status as one aspect of information, when the other aspect is found embodied in physical processing. It's a pretty cool idea. I think it's, I just reread some of these things recently, and it's still it's a very, very good book, The Conscious Mind by Chalmers. Now, what I thought that we could sort of combine our approach, with Bohm, Haile, myself, with this Chalmers, because one thing people know is that Chalmers' double aspect theory suffers from epiphenomenalism. But in our scheme, when modified, there's the possibility of genuine causal efficacy of phenomenal properties upon the physical domain. Because remember, in the Bohm theory, this information is actually making things happen. It's nothing like epiphenomenal. And if we could somehow show that the information has these phenomenal properties, then this is, we really, and we don't need to worry about like causal closure of the physical domain the same way as philosophers' minds do, because, you know, in quantum field theory, if you take the time energy uncertain principle, you can anyway violate that for a brief interval. This is what Beck and Eccles made use of their model. So I think anyway, I think we can see a possibility here which you don't have in the Chalmers early theory, at least. Now, the other thing here is that Chalmers thinks that it's an interesting possibility that some sort of activity is required for experience. So, you know, in the book, he would discuss, well, you know, does the thermostat have primitive experiences? But if you would require activity, then he would say the static information, for example, information in a thermostat in a constant state, is not likely to have experience associated with it. Now, but if we say that proto-phenomenal properties are always properties of some kind of active information, we could do justice to the intuition that activity is required for experience. Okay, how much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Excellent.
At least 10 minutes.
All right, great. I think we're fine then. Okay, anyway. Now, the other thing is that, of course, so you see, with panpsychism, somewhere there's the idea that, you know, we have this big thing like, you know, human being and the brain that's conscious. And then we're trying to explain that by saying, well, there are these little things that are conscious, and these somehow combine to make the big things conscious. So it's kind of a bottom up. And of course, the way we've been talking now with saying that the electron has has these proto-mental properties or whatnot, then kind of a bottom-up way of explaining the macro minds or macro systems, if you like. So somebody asked, so what are you doing here? I'm just doing like a quantized version of traditional panpsychism. Now, the thing is that quantum theory is very holistic, and it's really, actually wrote a paper about this already in '95, comparing Tom Nagel's panpsychism with Bohm's ideas, and you can realize that there's actually a tension between the more atomistic spirit of and a bottom-up panpsychism, and if you bring in quantum theory. And so we get a new way here to approach the combination problem. And you see, the combination problem presupposes what Harold Atmansbacher calls a compositional approach, namely explaining the properties of the whole in terms of its parts. But if you look at quantum theory, there are actually quite generally instances where the whole is prior to parts, and the philosopher Schaffer has written a very nice article about this. And so if you look at this Bohm-Heilig scheme, so you could say that the behavior of individual particles cannot be understood in terms of their spatial relationships only, but you really have to look at the quantum state of the whole system. So we do not explain the behavior of the whole in a bottom-up way in terms of the behavior of the parts, but we explain the behavior of the parts in a top-down way, partly in terms of the properties of the whole. And there's actually a pretty interesting paper by Aharonov and others on a completely top-down hierarchical structure in quantum mechanics, which I referenced there. Really, really hammering this point, if you like. Now, you see, and again, if you look at the many-body system in the Bohm-Heilig scheme, they are saying that they are like in superconductivity. There's this common pool of information that you cannot really reduce to the private pools of individual particles. So, and the whole is prior to the parts in the sense that these private pools arise from the common pool in certain circumstances through factorization. It could happen in some circumstances. It could be, I don't know, decoherence, temperature, environment, whatnot, that we get. Then you get the classical world out of the quantum world. So the key issue is to give an account of how the whole decomposes into parts, as opposed to the parts combining to constitute the whole. So we could summarize this part that just by saying that the Bohm-Hailey scheme has a pan-proto-psychic flavor in postulating that elementary particles have mind-like qualities when the quantum potential for a particle is non-negligible. You see, in some situations, the quantum potential will become zero almost, and then you have, for all practical purposes, Newtonian physics. So I guess that's, you lose your pan-proto quality, and you know, you can have also non-mental things in this picture. Non-mental object for all practical purposes, like billiard balls. Anyway, but you see, if we look at this scheme, then the emphasis on the priority of the whole, it actually goes against the spirit of the bottom-up way of explaining consciousness, which is characteristic of traditional panpsychism. So what we can do, let's get into the question of the session. Is the universe conscious? And let's consider the entire universe in the light of Bohm-Hailey quantum theory, with this idea that active information, proto-mental quality would be fundamental. Now, it would be suggested that the universe is a process which is in some sense simultaneously proto-mental and physical. If you think of the wave function of, you know, people talk about the wave function of the universe, and of course in this Bohm-Hailey scheme, this has to be understood as active information, providing all kinds of, you know, non-local correlations and also these common pools of information. And so is there any sense in which the universe as a whole with such dual aspect properties might be said to be conscious? Or is conscious experience restricted to certain individual biological organisms, or at most collectives of them, as our folk psychology and John Searle would have it? Okay, I like, you know, Searle has interesting ideas, but I guess he would say that it's obvious that this is, you know, there is no Weltgeist. I think he said that, yeah. Anyway, so I must actually confess that I haven't really thought of the question so much before this. I mean, it's kind of implicit, but it's not a question that has worried me. I guess I've my intuition. I've been quite happy to think about that the universe is not not conscious. So I'm the bad guy in the session if the others disagree. Anyway, so however, but of course, so if we explore the question in the light of Bohm's cosmology, which of course something that I've been interested in and trying to understand, you probably will find a somewhat different answer. And I did some digging in some interviews and stuff, and so let's give Bohm the final words. Then I don't have so much to say, so let's go to the guru or the master. So anyway, here it is. You see, Hegel, Marx, and Bohm. Why Hegel, Marx, and Bohm? Well, you know, these were Bohm's main philosophical influences, and this is how he described them in an interview. So, you know, with Hegel would say that thought is fundamental, and nature is mind showing itself to itself, mind's consciousness of itself through nature. So it's like, you know, mind is primary, but we need nature for this purpose. I don't know if it's like a mirror or. Whereas with Marx, he turns it upside down. He says that matter is fundamental, and then we have consciousness, which is matter showing itself to itself. This is this idea. And then comes Bohm, perhaps a bit like Spinoza, saying that neither matter nor mind is fundamental, but something unknown, namely a deeper or implicate ground. Of course, this sounds like this neutral monism or dual aspect monism that he's proposing here. And so, and this is an interview by René Weber in a book called Dialogues and Scientist Sages. There's some brilliant, really brilliant interviews in there. Some of them, you know, if you like more lively, you know, some of the Bohm's articles are pretty heavy reading, but some in these interviews he really comes to life, and it's you somehow find in a few paragraphs there you just find something that you'd be struggling to find in a book, like, you know, good summaries anyway. So again, I have to say self. So what you say is that because this deeper ground contains both matter and mind, it has to be self-aware in some sense. it is in the direction of mind, but beyond it. It's not below it, but above it. And I think this may give us a very good introduction to the next talk by Deepak, I hope. Anyway. Thank you very much. I also advertise an old book if somebody wants to read. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paavo. Very good. Interesting. I think there's, let's see. One question for Paavo, then we'll go to Deepak. Paavo, do you think the universe reduced itself as opposed to a big bang? Or Paavo, did Bohm ever argue that proto-phenomenal awareness was fundamentally necessary for physics to operate as understood by the standard model?
Yeah, I don't know. He was making that kind of strong claim for physics. Like, for example, he wasn't very much advocating this Russellian idea that people are very, you know, that there are no intrinsic properties and things like that. So I think it came more. I think it's more this idea that to understand quantum mechanics, we have to introduce something like the notion of active information and non-locality. You know, it also enables non-locality. Yeah. But I don't know that it was so much about the proto-phenomenal.
All right, friend. I think in 2000 they interviewed 10 famous physicists and asked them about a theory of everything, and only Roger suggested that consciousness was necessary to account for collapse of the wave function. So Bohm is close, but hinting in that direction. But anyway, thank you. We'll go to Deepak, and then we'll have some time for questions. So Paavo Pylkkänen, thank you so much. Excellent as always, and appreciate it. And now our final speaker, a man who almost literally needs no introduction. He's knows so many interesting and important people worldwide, and it's he's proud to say he's a friend of mine. And without further ado, Deepak Chopra. Deepak, good to see you.
Thank you, Stuart. It's been great fun listening to all of you. I should start by saying that I'm not a professional philosopher, nor am I a scientist. My training is internal medicine, endocrinology, neuroendocrinology, to some extent neuroscience. But I am interested, of course, in what we're talking about today, the nature of fundamental reality, the nature of consciousness, the nature of the universe. So I'd like to start by reading something that I got in a letter from the NASA Lunar Science Institute a few years ago. I'm just going to read it to you. So it says, consider that you can see less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum and hear less than 1% of the acoustic spectrum. As you read this, or as you listen to me, you're traveling at 220 kilometers per second across the galaxy. 90% of the cells in your body carry their own microbial DNA and are not you. The atom, because they're microbial. The atoms in your body are 99.9999999% empty space, and none of them are the ones you were born with. But they all originated in the belly of a star. Human beings have 46 chromosomes, 2 less than the common potato. The existence of the rainbow depends on the conical photoreceptors in your eyes. To animals without cones, the rainbow does not exist. So you don't just look at a rainbow, you create it. This is pretty amazing, especially considering that all the beautiful colors you see represent less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's a pretty interesting statement here, because it actually points to a very fundamental principle. We cannot trust our senses. You know, our senses tell the earth is flat. Nobody believes that anymore. The senses tell me I'm standing on a stationary surface. I know it's spinning at dizzying speeds and hurtling through space at thousands of miles an hour. And my entire experience, everyday experience of reality is 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum and 1% of the acoustic spectrum. Of course, we have ways, scientific instruments now to peer deeper into the nature of reality. So you can look at things macroscopically, objects, space-time, and all kinds of theories about that, grand unification still being attempted, general relativity, and so on. You can go microscopic and look at ultra microscopic structures, but then there comes a point where everything disappears that you can see or perceive. And you end up, according to modern science, with something called the quantum vacuum, which is, you can't see. It's a theoretical construct, although there's lots of evidence for it. But whatever that quantum vacuum is, and I've asked physicists, is it in space-time? Is the quantum vacuum in space-time? And, you know, I get interesting answers, but most of them agree that we actually don't really know if the quantum vacuum is part of space-time. That's part of the grand unification theory. How do we, you know, how do we come to terms with gravity as part of quantum mechanics? Having said that, today, if I go on the internet and I ask the following questions, how many galaxies are there? You'll find there might be, according to modern cosmologists, 2 trillion galaxies. 2 trillion galaxies. According to same cosmic theories today, there are probably 700 sextillion stars. I don't know how to write that. Your mathematicians can figure that out. And based on that, uncountable trillions of planets. Uncountable trillions of planets. In fact, there may be 60 billion habitable planets in just the Milky Way galaxy, according to some cosmologists. 50% of the atoms in your body are supposed to have come from different galaxies, not even the Milky Way galaxy. Okay, 50% drawn into this galaxy through a process called gravitational wind. So who are we? And who's asking these questions? If I look at it, I think with a little bit of analysis, then our planet is not even a speck of dust, not even one speck of grain of sand in all the beaches of our planet Earth. Not even one grain of sand in all the beaches of the Earth. And on this little planet, somewhere in the junkyard of infinity, we have a species called Homo sapiens that is trying to solve what we call the hard problem of consciousness. I'll tell you, this is amazing that one little species that is not even the equivalent of COVID-19 on scale is trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness. And so I think we have to put things in a little perspective right now, is that all the arguments we've heard, debates we've heard, agreements are in consciousness. Science is an activity in consciousness. Mathematics is an activity in consciousness. Observations are made in consciousness. Theories, no matter what theory you come up with, integrated theory, or panpsychism, pan-protopsychism, they're constructed. These theories are conceived in consciousness. Consciousness conceives, constructs, governs every experience we have. So, without being a scientist or a mathematician or a philosopher, I ask you to participate with me some experiments in consciousness that yogis do. Okay, people like me who are yogis, who understand a little bit of the language that you're speaking of, but not totally, I have to say. Integrated information, panpsychism, pan-protopsychism, cosmopsychism are things I learned from you guys at these conferences. Very grateful to you. But now direct experience. What's my direct experience? And before I say what the direct experience is, I would also like to define consciousness, because, we talk about consciousness But what is consciousness? How do you define consciousness? And in Eastern wisdom traditions and contemplative traditions, consciousness is the source of all experience, period. Consciousness is the knowing element in every experience. Now you can elaborate on that and you say consciousness is that in which all experience occurs. We are sharing an experience right now in shared consciousness within a particular bandwidth of electromagnetic activity. We call this cyberspace. But what we call cyberspace right now is a shared space of consciousness within a very particular restricted bandwidth of human perception, period. Outside this particular bandwidth, there's a lot of things happening in the world. We're not aware of them, but they're happening. We're not aware of them. And what we're experiencing right now as humans is a species-specific perceptual activity. So now let's go with the experiments, experiments in consciousness. I'd like everyone to close their eyes, just for a second. Okay. And if you close your eyes, even for a second, now please open your eyes. Okay. When you close your eyes, that's what the world really is like. That's what the world is like. Nothing. Now open your eyes, and this is what you construct visually. You construct visual experience, and any cognitive scientist will tell you this. So what is this? Well, it's a hand. What is that? It's a rainbow. What's that? It's a tree. What's that? It's a cloud. What's this? It's a body. What's this? It's a microphone. These are human constructs for perceptual activities in human awareness, period. And we saw these beautiful slides from Miri and many others here where you could kind of try and guess what a human would look like to a cat, okay? We saw those pictures, and it's very obvious that every experience is species specific. I have no idea. Ultimately, I don't even have any idea what you're experiencing or what we agree on our experiences as labels. We say this is purple, this is red, this is yellow, but I have no idea what you're experiencing when you say this is purple. Nor do I have any idea what Stuart is experiencing as taste as he drank what I presume is his coffee. But this is human experience. I don't know what you're experiencing subjectively, but what about the experience of a bat or a honeybee that is navigating through, you know, whatever, ultraviolet, a snake navigating through infrared, a chameleon's eyeballs swivel on two different axes. I don't even have any idea what this looks like to a chameleon. No idea. So what is the world made of? I mean, if we go on the internet right now, again, type out, what are the 125 questions, open questions in science? You'll see immediately, the first question is, what is the universe made of? And that's a tough question because everything I said right now, 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, uncountable planets, is actually less than 0.01% of what exists out there. 0.01%, and without going into details, because there are many experts here, 96% of the universe is dark matter, dark energy. Whatever it is, it's not atomic. Okay. That's what we know with theoretical constructs like WIMPs, weakly interactive massive particles. These are theoretical particles, but no one's seen them. Fundamentally, we don't know. 96% of the universe is presumably non-atomic. Of the remaining 44% that's atomic, most of it, 99.99999% of it is invisible interstellar dust. So what we're talking about the universe, 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, and uncountable trillions of planets, not even 0.01%. Based on that, we are coming up with our theories about what is the universe made of, okay, based on that. And the answer is, the simplest answer is, it's made of nothing, okay, because whatever our theories are, doesn't matter, quantum mechanical, the virtual particle, fundamental reality, as we go deep into it, ends up being made of nothing that we can call has physical form, that has physical form. Subatomic particles have physical form when observed, as we know, but as has been said so frequently here, waves don't have a physical form. Waves of probability do not have units of mass and energy. Only particles have units of mass and energy. So what is a wave made of? What is these probability waves made of? And I frankly can tell you, I have no idea. Okay, are they physical? They don't have a form. They don't have a physical form. A probability wave has no physical form. So whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, the ground state, let's call it the ground state, it has no form, period. Now, we can call it the quantum vacuum, but I've been talking to my physicist friends and say, is there something deeper than the quantum vacuum? Like Paavo suggested. Paavo suggested that both mind and matter are simultaneous expressions of a more deeper reality, which he called the implicate order, a term used by David Bohm. So, but one thing we can say is whatever this fundamental reality is, it doesn't have a physical form. Not having a physical form or a boundary. Physical forms have boundaries. Doesn't matter how small the boundary is. Subatomic particle, atom, molecule, galaxy, there's a boundary. But something is formless, it doesn't have a boundary. So we were asked earlier about the fields, and Mary said she was using the word field metaphorically, and rightly so, because fields have boundaries. What is a field that has no boundary? I can only say it must be infinite, because only the infinite is formless. Only the infinite is formless. So even when we go through standard, rational, scientific thinking, the ground state of the universe, whatever it is infinite, boundless. Many times we've had conversations with physicists, quantum physicists. I'm not one. I've asked quantum physicists, is there one thing you guys can agree on? One thing that you guys can agree on about the nature of fundamental reality. And I've been told that that one thing that everybody agrees on is fundamental reality has no boundaries. It's boundaryless. Okay. Now, so what is the nature of this boundaryless entity, whatever it is, which has no boundaries and therefore no form, and therefore it's infinite? Is it consciousness? Could it be consciousness? This is what the Eastern wisdom traditions say. They say if you take out all the objects, including your own physical body, let's imagine, this is a thought experiment. Take away all the objects, including your physical body, everything disappears, including space-time. Including space-time. You need objects in order to have the experience of space-time. So that's experiment number one. Number two, experiment number one, you close your eyes, there's nothing. You open your eyes, you construct the universe. Every visual experience is not just seeing, it's a construction. This is a construction. A baby has no idea that this is called a phone, or this is called a microphone, or this is called a hand. What does the baby see? Colors, shapes, and forms. The rest is a story, a human story, and a human created story. In the same way as atoms and molecules are human constructs, even force fields, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak interactions, all of these are human constructs for human modes of knowing and experience in human consciousness, period. What is the nature of mind? Mind is the fluctuation of consciousness as thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Mind is the fluctuations, the vibrations of consciousness as thoughts, feelings, emotions, imagination. Okay, let's try another experiment. Think of a rainbow. Think of a sunset. Think of a beautiful lake where you can see the shimmering of the moon on the lake. Just now choose one of those experiences, a beautiful sunset in the ocean. If I go inside your brain, there's no picture of that sunset that you're seeing. So where is it? What is the location of the sunset that you experience in imagination? There's no location. There's all you see in the brain is whatever we call neural correlates, but those are also an experience. Okay, there is no location for sound, even though there's a neural correlate, but there's no sound in the brain. There's no location for pictures in the brain, even though the occipital cortex shows neural correlates. Where are those pictures? Where, if you think of your mother, I do this frequently. My mother passed away many years ago. If I think of her, I can see her face, I can hear her voice, I can even smell her skin. I experience, as Miri said, nostalgia and love. Where is this happening? I mean, for every experience I have, there's some neural correlate, which is also an experience. I mean, how do I know there's a brain? Because I see one. So where is the experience of the brain happening? So here's one experiment, another one. Just move your finger against your thumb. Have the attitude that your finger is moving and feeling the thumb. And now switch the attitude, the thumb is feeling the finger. Which is the subject, which is the object? The first case, this was the subject of experience. This is feeling, this is the knower, this is the known. This is the observer, this is that which observed. This is the feeler, that is the felt. Now switch. This becomes the observer and this becomes the observed. So it's obvious that the distinction between the observer and the observed is arbitrary. You know, you are both the observer and the observed. What are you observing is a perceptual activity, which is a fluctuation of consciousness in the same way as the mental activity. So there's no inside, there's no outside. This whole idea that there's an observer that is embodied, well, have you ever found an embodied observer? Where is the observer? Everybody talks about the observer. The observer can't be found. People talk about out-of-body experiences. We can't even explain an in-body experience because there's no one inside the body. So if we understand this, and if we just substitute words like objects, just substitute the word object with the word experience. That's it. I substitute the word object with the experience, then I break down the experience. This is a collection of colors, shapes, and forms. It's also a collection of sensations. It could be smell, it could be sound, it could be taste. It's also a thought, microphone. So what is this? It's a collection of sensations, images, feelings, perceptions, and thoughts, period. That's all there is. Sensations, perceptions, images, feelings, thoughts. The rest is a story. It was a mythical story, it was a religious story, it was a theological story, it was a philosophical story, and now it's a scientific story. And no one asks, who is making up these stories? Who made up these stories? Who made up latitude? Who made up longitude? Who made up Greenwich Mean Time? Who made up the story of money? Who made up Wall Street? Who made up nation states? Who made up democracy? The whole thing is a construct. There is no universe. The universe is a human construct in the human mind, which itself is a fluctuation of consciousness based on human perceptions, which are fluctuations of consciousness. Bottom line, there's no universe, there's no body, there's no brain, there are no subatomic particles, there are no force fields, there's no gravity. These are experiences before we call them such. So a tree is an experience more than an object, and it's a human experience. It's not the experience of a bee or a butterfly or an insect with 100 eyes or a bird or a snake or any other species. What I'm talking about is a human construct that was created by humans, human species. Your body is not the subject of experience, it's an object of experience. Your mind is not the subject of experience. Your thoughts are objects. They appear on the screen of consciousness. In fact, your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, your perceptions, your interpretations of them, your constructs of gravity, electromagnetism, force fields are all appearing on the screen of consciousness. And these are very convenient constructs, of course. We didn't stick to Greenwich Mean Time, we wouldn't have this conference. If I told you, let's meet on the corner of Broadway on 56th, let's go to Serafina and have Caesar salad, we made up the whole thing. There's Broadway is a human construct, Serafina restaurant is a human construct, Caesar salad is a human construct, but it's convenient. Okay, so we have created the universe. You are the universe, Stuart. I am the universe. All these philosophers are universe, but so are insects, so are bees, and so are trees. They're all part of the matrix, literally the matrix of qualia that we call the universe, but the qualia are also species specific. And by qualia, I want to make a very simple definition of qualia. Not fancy, you know, it's not just the taste of red wine or the smell of garlic. Qualia is quality of awareness, quality of awareness. Whether it's red wine or the smell of garlic or the period of an end of a sentence or a neural correlate, they're all qualias. The qualias meaning quality of awareness. And what are qualia? They're modified forms of awareness as sensations, images, feelings, perceptions, and thoughts. An acronym for this would be SIFT, S-I-F-T. All experience is SIFT. Inside, outside, this is a human being, that's a butterfly, that's an eagle, human constructs. Even, we saw this beautiful slide from Miri, presumably a cat looking at a human, right? But even the cat is a human construct. A cat doesn't know it's called a cat. Only humans call it a cat. Okay? We are part of a matrix of species-specific qualia in an infinite universe, and our body-mind is part of the experience. Body-mind is the object of experience. Thought is the object of experience. Feelings are objects of experience. And the rest, as I said, human constructs that end up creating the experience. So when we go and peer beyond space-time, matter, and energy, we go beyond that. We come to a formless, self-aware field of possibilities. That's it. It's also unpredictable. It is, I think, creative. It is self-evolving. It is self-regulating and self-organizing. And what we experience as our mind is just one species-specific bandwidth of experience in a bandwidth of experiences that could be possibly infinite. Infinite knowers, infinite modes of knowing, infinite objects known, but they're all within that one field of consciousness fluctuating within itself, and it is self-aware. It is not in space-time. Space-time are emergent, and they are also human constructs. There is no space-time. There is only consciousness having a party with itself as infinite knowers, infinite modes of knowing, and infinite objects known, given names. Every form is a phenomenon. Every phenomenon is a fluctuation of sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, perceptions, and every fluctuation comes from that which is inconceivable. The infinite is inconceivable. It's not in space-time. It is what is conceiving. It is what governs. It is what constructs. And it is what becomes what we call the universe. So, Is the universe conscious? No. Only consciousness is conscious. The universe is a construct in human consciousness. There is only consciousness, there's nothing else. Monistic materialism is dead for the reasons we just heard. Nobody knows if you ask what is the fundamental nature of matter, nobody can tell you. So it's dead. And then based on this idea of matter, we struggle to create the hard problem. How does atoms and molecules create mind when in fact both mind and these molecules are human constructs in consciousness? It's the question doesn't make sense to me. If monistic materialism is dead, monistic idealism, I think, is also in a sense dead, because if you think that mind creates matter, then you have to explain how does mind create matter. Dualism is dead. It violates all the laws of conservation of energy. If mind and matter are two separate things, what is the mode of exchange? How does one, which is part of the hard problem as well, what is the energy consumed when mind interacts with matter? Where does it come from? So dualism is dead. Monistic monism, if we understand that as consciousness only, or what Paavo called the implicate order, something that is inconceivable because it has no form, therefore infinite, that is what is curving back within itself and conceives, governs, constructs, and becomes everything that we call reality, including our own self. And now that people are talking about infinite universes, multiverses, actually I'm very comfortable with that, because they're all constructed in consciousness anyway. String theories and all these other universes are constructed in consciousness without ever asking who is doing the science. You know, we can't explain any experience, including the experience of science. That's it for me.
Thank you, Deepak. Well, I would have bet wrong on your answer to is the universe conscious. So there you go. I'm glad we had this session. Here's a question for Deepak, then we'll open it up to everybody. Is the notion of consciousness, you defend all the wholeness of the human consciousness, or are you claiming a super consciousness? Are you defending a kind of solipsism? Please explain.
Yeah, solipsism, a very interesting term. Solipsism, I think, applies individual consciousness. I don't think I'm advocating solipsism in that I construct the word as my ego mind constructs the word. Even the ego mind is a construct. So I'm not defending solipsism.
Okay, good. So we have some questions. We have about 24 minutes, I think. Is that right, for the session? So can I start by asking the speakers if you would like to ask one of the other speakers something?
I am actually very comfortable with every speaker, what they said. It's part of the puzzle. And I'm sympathetic to every viewpoint here, because you put those points together, I think we'll all agree the consciousness is fundamental.
Okay, Philip, did you have a question?
I was very interested in, well, I was interested in all the talks, but something in Miri's talk that's, I guess, pertinent to my stuff, this suggestion of an explanatory gap in panpsychism, which is interesting to me because I'm a panpsychist and I'm keen to avoid explanatory gaps. And so looking back at her slides, so the thought is that it's qualities inside a subject's perspective are trying to implement a mind-independent abstract structure. But I was wondering whether this applies when we're thinking of cosmopsychism, because if you've just got, you know, so as I'm thinking of it, if you think of the structure, if you think of the complete description of reality in the language of fundamental physics, you know, every single quark or electron, that very, very rich, complex structure, why couldn't that just be the structure of the experience of the universe subject? So that very structure is filled out by a very complex conscious experience. So why is there a gap there, I guess?
Okay, so
Okay, go ahead.
two answers to that. First, if it's a cosmopsychist materialism as opposed to a, like Bernardo Kastrup's, a cosmopsychist idealism. So if you're materialism, you've still got this mind-independent exterior of the cosmos, which is being implemented by the cosmos's interior. So maybe, I don't quite know how that would pan out. Perhaps they come to the same thing, but I understand that we can in principle make a difference between cosmopsychist materialism and cosmopsychist idealism. But the second answer to the question, why don't I just go for a kind of cosmopsychism, is that cosmopsychists generally, as you do, Philip, take the universe to be a subject with a perspective. And I have a problem, I didn't talk about this in my talk, but I call it the decombination problem, which is how can consciousness belonging to a perspective confer its conscious experience on other subjects, either by decombining if you're a cosmos or combining if you're like small particles. And so the view that I advocate, the conscious ground as aperspectival, so you don't have to get your consciousness in virtue of other subjects breaching their hermetic boundaries and spilling their experiences into something else. So I was actually going to ask you sort of more of the question about the qualia transferring. I mean, how does that work? Like, I find that really mysterious.
Well, there's some fundamental laws going on here, and you know, I think it's completely scientifically plausible to involve fundamental laws. You know, science does it all the time. There's plenty of precedent for kind of non-reductive explanations. The only question is, can you do it in an empirically adequate way, in a way that fits the empirical facts? And so that's what I'm struggling to do. But yeah, so it'd basically just be fundamental laws that determine that these subjects emerge and that they inherit certain aspects of the conscious experience of the universe. And that it's just going to be a fundamental. And we looked in neuroscience, you know, the best systematization of the correlations neuroscience finds to guide us in those laws. I gave integrated information theory as one example. But, you know, ultimately we look to science. Just on, I mean, you just contrasting idealism with cosmopsychism. I mean, the more and more I think about this, I'm not sure whether these are just two different ways of describing the same view. And I'm not sure about this. I'm really interested in this question. You know, so I think there's a universe subject there, and I'm causally interacting with it and representing it in my consciousness. I think of that as material, as a kind of what you call panpsychism materialism, that it's the physical universe. It happens to be conscious, but it's the physical universe. But you could describe it in maybe an idealist term. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether these are two different ways of describing the same thing, but yeah, I don't know.
May I ask a question, both of Philip and Miri and anybody else? You keep saying, in my view, I think. What do you mean by I? What is I? I mean, that's very fundamental. If I is the subject of experience and you are that subject of experience, I personally have a problem, because I think there is only one subject of experience. Everything else is an object. A thought is an object. Perception is an object. And there are innumerable objects, subtle and gross. The gross objects are what we call physical matter, but they're perceptions. And the subtle objects are what we call mind. They are subtle perceptions or subtle experiences. But the only subject is universal I, period. Everything else is an object. So when I say I already know that the I that I'm referring to as the subject actually doesn't exist.
I think Miri is more closer to you on that score, isn't it? Yeah.
So what I would say is, I think we have to be clear on the terminology. So when the Advaitins use the word subject or self with a capital S, they're maybe talking about the consciousness that doesn't have a perspective. It doesn't have a localized point of view. So I would agree with you that is the ground, but that there are subjects in the sense, how I define it, is as perspectives taken on other objects, and those objects turn out to be the outward appearance of other subjects.
Yeah,
so I think it's useful to make that distinction between subject and object defined that way.
Actually, Mary, your first slide, the last sentence said it all, as far as I'm concerned. Your first slide that you showed, the last sentence, when the eye dropped, all that remained was reality.
That's Sri Ramana.
Yeah, that's the viewpoint I have.
I'm not yet persuaded that there's only one subject. I mean, this could be something you just know from experience, and but whether it's, I haven't seen that demonstrated by arguments. But I'm not saying one should only look to arguments. It could be that this can be known in experience, and I just haven't had those experiences. But I'm just saying I haven't seen this demonstrated on the basis of arguments.
I agree. When I look for something called matter, I can't find it. I really cannot find a substance called matter. I can only find my own perceptions.
Yeah, but
I want to push back against,
matter, the
ahead,
reason
Paavo.
why we assume there's a matter and an external object is that it will explain why you have all those appearances and why is there a coherence between all those appearances. So I mean, in some ways, of course, it's the whole point that because there are the appearances, then, and as human beings, that's all we have. I mean, many people think that's what we kind of have access to, but of course, it doesn't follow that there is no matter. There's no proof that there are no material objects.
What is matter?
Well, perhaps in this case, it is what gives rise to our appearances, or.
Oh, I see. So the appearances come from matter, and matter is not an appearance.
Well, in some ways, of course, you study it deeper and deeper. So you always will come to an appearance. But typically what we do, we always postulate an essence that gives rise to the appearances. So that's the way sciences always work, that you start with the table and then you study it and you realize the table was an appearance, but the essence was the atoms. And then you assume, but then you study the atoms and you found, okay, the atoms they turn out to be an appearance. So of course, there's a double role in some ways that they play both roles, but it doesn't mean that therefore there are no essences anywhere. I mean, it could be the case that there are no essences, but I don't think we have a proof that there is no essence anywhere.
Paavo, is the appearance out there? Is the appearance in here? Where is the appearance? Where am I having the experience of looking at you right now? Where is that happening?
Yeah, well, of course, it could be in the virtual reality of your consciousness, but the fact that there is a virtual reality consciousness doesn't prove that there is no, that the real world doesn't exist. That's, of course, John Searle has a very nice chapter in his book called "Does the Real World Exist?", where he goes through all these kind of anti-realist arguments, and I mean, they're very interesting. I think it's very. Of course, this is the sort of the essence of philosophy, to worry about the appearance versus reality. But we have to just be careful that we realize still that, who knows, maybe there is a reality of some sort. Of course, Immanuel Kant thought there's the Ding und sich, and which it exists, but we know nothing about it. Perhaps that there's this noumenal causation through which the Ding und sich gives rise to the appearances. And, people like Niels Bohr said in quantum mechanics that, there are quantum objects, but perhaps we cannot even conceive of them. So he was very silent about the nature of quantum objects. Then you have somebody like David Bohm who says, or Roger Penrose, who wants to have a more realist view of quantum object and say they want to talk about, the electron is such and such a thing, has properties, and, there's this quantum field. So there's always this, I think it's very typical of tension in science and philosophy, that some people are more for the essence, if you like, and the others are more for the appearance. And I don't think we I guess if we could easily decide one way or the other, philosophy had been dead long ago.
Yeah, I know. One more thing and then I'll shut up, because I'm a physician and I'm very interested in what happens to the human body. What's the body made of? Atoms, molecules, force fields, energy, is it consciousness? So one of the things that I've gotten interested recently is VR, virtual reality. And, you can treat many illnesses with VR experiences. Somebody has burns, you put them in a VR experience, which is extremely cold, and they don't feel the burn, etc., etc. But with VR, you can trigger biological responses all the time. Where you can scare a person, blood pressure goes up. So what the VR is made of and your body is made of is the same thing, actually. They're all part of the virtual reality, and now people are talking about simulation and a simulation universe. But, Wittgenstein, he said, our life is a dream. We are asleep. Once in a while, we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming. So what are we waking up to? Because it is, in fact, a dream. Anything that can't be held on to is a dream. By the time you hear my words, they don't exist. By the time you look at this, you look at something else, you look at this again, it's not exactly the same experience. Okay, so every perceptual experience is a snapshot, and between the snapshot is a discontinuity, which is formless. So when I say, now imagine a sunset, you converted something which is formless, whatever it is, into that picture. But it's the same thing when you see something. You convert colors, shapes, and forms into objects. You call them names. And suddenly, the object, which is a reified perceptual activity, actually assumes an independent entity.
I think Deepak asks a good question, what is matter? And the answer I would give is consciousness. So I think, physics gives this abstract mathematical structure. The question is what fills out that structure? I would say it's consciousness that fills out that structure. But so superficially it sounds like a different view to Deepak and Miri's that, so at least Deepak saying there is no matter, there's just consciousness. I would say there is matter, and it is consciousness. And then, but I'm thinking more and more, how are these idealist and panpsychist views really different from each other? Or are they different ways of saying the same thing? This is something I've been thinking more and more about recently, and I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. But yeah, anyway.
I want to ask Deepak a question. Deepak, you said there is no space-time and or it's formless. Then
And
or it's formless. It doesn't have any form. There's no space-time and it's formless. But what about curved space-time? General relativity. The fact that light from a distant star bends around the sun so we can see it in an eclipse, or that space-time is curved. What's curving?
Consciousness is curving. That's all. Consciousness curves, creates experiences, then we interpret them as space-time, energy, information, matter. You wouldn't have the experience of space if there wasn't the appearance of objects. So space is an inferred experience. You don't see space. Everything we understand about consciousness is inferential, period. Okay, because consciousness only can know consciousness. The rest is a very useful construct, just like democracy is a construct, or money is a construct. These are constructs and they're very useful. Matter is a very useful construct. Space-time is a very useful construct for humans. A horseshoe crab at the bottom of the ocean doesn't give a shit.
Okay, here's the question.
It's conscious too, right?
One could say that with Karl Popper, of course, had this argument about, for realism, perhaps saying that, if you drop an atomic bomb and kill all the people, so it's okay, we could say, well, that's nothing but consciousness. But of course, the other view, the materialist view would be that, well, there are real physical bodies and there are real bombs. And of course, if you attack people, then that will give rise to pain. And that we have to explain how come doing physical things to a physical body gives rise to this mental experience and pains and things like that. So then again, about this thing about bending the light rays, then if we're saying that, then we're just saying that the laws of consciousness are the laws of general relativity, because really to make sense of why the light is bending, we need to know the physics. And
I think
so
what we call,
do it that way if you like, but I mean, this is the, you know, the question is then which view makes more sense. And at least, I mean, I can see the temptation with you know, the panpsychism or the this kind of maybe a more subjective idealism that Deepak is advocating, but I can also see the temptation with the more, if you like, more traditional materialism, which of course has to be radically changed because of, you know, modern physics and even consciousness. But I feel we're just making it far too easy for ourselves if we completely forget the pull of good old-fashioned materialism, which was of course very important part of history of philosophy and science as well, you know, all the way from the ancient Greeks. So I just feel that, you know, we're playing, if you like, a different game that I like the game where the materialist has also a little bit of a, you know, of course it depends on what the intuitions are, what the arguments are, but I don't know, I just want to.
So Paavo, the non-dual consciousness only person would say that you hit a bus, the bus is in consciousness, the body is in consciousness, and the pain is in consciousness. It's all part of the virtual reality. And
but it doesn't follow that there is no real bus. It doesn't follow.
No, the experience is real. The experience is real. The experience is real.
Experience is real, but there may be also the real object that which is a physical object. That, you know, we could also have this thing that there is, you know, there's the if you like, a real object, and then there's my experience of the object. I mean, that we have the two. I mean, that's of course that view will have its problems, but it's still a kind of a coherent possibility, and it actually makes a lot of sense as well, and it helps to explain a lot of things, and that's why a lot of people haven't given up that, although you can easily, I guess it's also characteristic of philosophy that almost any view you take, somebody can come along and criticize it. And that you can do that to panpsychism, you can do this to materialism, you can also do that to this kind of, you know, what Deepak is saying. So absolutely. I think this is and that's why I guess we could still debate these issues 1 year, 2 year, maybe 100 years from now.
So it's important though to get clear on what we're trying to do. What are the criteria? What are we trying to do here? And the way I think of it is, you know, we're trying to account for the empirical data and what Paavo is saying about, you know, the regularities of experience come into that. We're also trying to account for the reality of consciousness in an intelligible way that doesn't involve explanatory gaps. And I think the project is look for the simplest theory that can do both of those. I mean, I think, you know, the attraction of panpsychism is, I think it's the best of both worlds. It has the attractions of materialism, that it says, you know, physics is kind of spot on with the causal structure of reality, but it also gives an intelligible account of consciousness. So anyway, I think, you know, that it's important to, you know, what are we trying to do here? And then once we've got the criteria, you know, we can start to think about the best theory for achieving those goals.
Phil, you used I actually was listening to you when you said, you know, you were addressing reductionism and holism. And when you pointed to parts, you said they're an activity of the whole. I actually related to that, because when you look at an empirical fact, whatever that is, it's hiding the truth. It's hiding you have to ignore everything in order to experience or know a Higgs boson. You have to ignore everything else. And then you start from there. But what is a Higgs boson? It's an experience. And by the time you have it in the Hadron Collider, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two arguments actually that Deepak's getting at. One is sort of that epistemologically all we have is consciousness. I'm not that persuaded by that argument, because we could say, well, okay, epistemologically, the starting point is consciousness, but maybe we can infer the existence of other things. I think the stronger argument is, okay, this matter out there, what is its nature? Tell me what it is, tell me what it is. And I think, you know, all we do get from physical science is this abstract structure. But if we say, no, there is that abstract structure out there, but it's filled with consciousness. Then we give an intelligible account of its nature. We give an intelligible account of the emergence of our own consciousness and that of other animals. And that's it. We do everything we need to do.
Well, we're getting there slowly.
Maybe asymptotically. Hey, that was a fantastically interesting session, you guys. Thank you so much. We're about out of time. There are a couple more questions here, but we got to get set up for the concurrent discussion group. So, and I think this group probably spans the globe more than any other session. We go from Western Australia to Europe, several places in Europe and several places in the States. So I don't know what the distances are, but it's a long way. So thank you all for being here from Western Australia to Europe. And Deepak, it looked like you're in California. And thank you so much. So it was a great session. I was going to take a survey on whether the panelists think that the universe is conscious, but I think we'll just leave that up to everybody and follow up somehow on that question. I was surprised Deepak said no, but anyway, thank you all very much. Have a great evening. We'll be going to the Zoom concurrence, and then, oh no, we're going to, I'm sorry, Antonio Damasio, excuse me, is coming up next. Richard Lane is here to...
I know Miri's a big fan of Antonio Damasio.
Pardon me?
Miri's a huge fan of Damasio.
Yeah, talk about his work.
Yeah. Thank you. So that'll be coming up at what time? 5 o'clock, 20 minutes from now. So thank you all very much, and come back in 20 minutes to hear Antonio Damasio. Have a great evening, morning, or whatever it is there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Lots of fun. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Paavo.